Hello and welcome to this week's review on Dragon Ball Daima. This week I'm doing my review of the entire series. Now, this is not going to be a play-by-play, episode-by-episode, storyline-by-storyline review. This is me reviewing the entire series as a singular entity. And we kick off this review, as we always do with these reviews, by talking about the positives and the headline positives. All the big things I'm going to be talking about over the course of this review. The animation is the best I think we've ever had within the Dragon Ball anime series. The fight choreography is frequently fantastic, and this entire series feels like a love letter to Dragon Ball as a whole entity. Now, this is my second time doing this video. The first version of it was nearly an hour long, so hopefully this review can be a lot more efficient and I don't get lost on these tangents, because needless to say, and I might be giving spoilers here, I did bloody love this series. So, for one final time for this series of reviews, at least until I do a retrospective at some point in the future, it's time for me to praise and gush over the animation. Now, as I've said in the past, and I will admit there will be certain points I will be echoing things I said in my mid-series review, I do hate it when people treat a subjective opinion as objective fact, but I will just say that for me at least, I feel the animation that we get in this series is just so fantastic that it's almost objectively the best animation that we've ever had in Dragon Ball. Oh sure, there are certain moments towards the end of Super which are fantastic, but I think consistently this series has just had brilliant animation pretty much from start to finish. Oh sure, there's a couple bits here and there that don't quite land, but it's only small bits. It's only stuff that I'm only noticing it because I'm doing reviews of it, and if I was watching it more casually, I'd never see it. This isn't quite the early part of Super where some of the between shots just look a bit you-know-what, but still, with this series, there's so much fluidity and flair to so much of it, from the action sequences to the moments of humour, to the grander storytelling and world-building moments. It all feels alive, it all feels as though it has this energy and spirit to it, which makes it feel like we are truly on this grand adventure, and that this really is the kind of big televisual event that it should be. This isn't just a new series of Dragon Ball, this is a major event in worldwide television, with the animation itself feeling the next step, the evolution of the Dragon Ball series. Whilst we can ultimately debate how much of a global event a new Dragon Ball series ultimately is, we at the very least can say is that this does have the feel and the production quality of something that genuinely is a major televisual event, and it is present in every aspect of it. The animation, the art style, the presentation, all of it feels as though this is very much the global event that many fans will argue that it is. The animation style helps to reintroduce a sense of personality and character into the series, which I feel has been lacking for an extended period of time. Not to knock the animation that we've had up until this moment, but the animation that we had in Super and to an extent in Z felt as though it was heavily focused on action. Everyone was designed in such a ways that it would make the action sequences look impressive, that the characters would look heroic or intimidating depending on what they are, that it would have this scale and heroism and the action behind it to make it this truly visceral thing. But when moments of humour came along with those characters, moments that could be quirky or silly, those characters looked off in certain moments telling those gags because their design didn't quite lend itself to that. In Daima, we have characters that are designed in such a way as though they can be used for silly, wacky moments, but they can also be done in ways which are serious and more intense, without the ever feeling distracting that you see that particular character being used in that particular way. For example, the episode we get with the Minotaur, their design at one moment can easily be creepy and serious and intimidating, and then pivot into something more silly and quirky, without the design feeling as though it's out of place. That they can go from being a threat to our heroes to someone that's just kind of a silly goof. Similarly with Goku, we see him as come in this way that he's designed from being a silly funster that we all know to, when he gets mad and angry, someone that has intensity and power behind them, and all the while without the ever feeling out of place. The fact that Goku can be as powerful as he is even in this form doesn't feel out of place, it doesn't feel silly, it doesn't feel quite as jarring as it does when he does those similar kind of moments within GT. This series has a design which is able to sit comfortably within the Venn diagram of design for humour and design for action in a way which really works, that our characters can pivot from those moments of being silly or being funny or being scary or being actiony or whatever, being serious I should say rather than actiony, but you get the idea. And this really helps to sell those moments of comedy that we get throughout. This stuff with the gendarmerie force and their flamboyantness, and Do and Ku going to the supermarket, Ku trying to sell himself to Aransu for failing to defeat the Tamagami, and oh, I'm really quick and I can do the shopping and that stuff, and the every moment that we get where Goma bollocking Degasu, it's all done in ways which feel expressive and filled with an energy and a warmth that feels fun, that feels fantastic, that feels alive. It isn't quite as cartoony as the design in the original Dragon Ball, but it's oftentimes not as stiff as what we ended up getting in Super. There is a skill and craft to the animation that makes everything feel brilliant, whether that is our main cast being able to pivot from light-hearted stuff to serious stuff, to the design of the realms that we characters find themselves in, and the extra characters that we see in the background. Daima, the demon realm, it is not your typical world of demons that you see in fiction. It's not a world of fire and brimstone or something that we've seen described or depicted in other forms of fiction, in other forms of spirituality, in other religions. Nor is it one that is quite too similar to what we get in other Dragon Ball related scenarios. Oh sure, it does feel very familiar, particularly to those of us who do remember watching the original Dragon Ball series. It does have a distinct feel as though we are seeing echoes and reflections of stuff that we have seen before, but it still has its own unique feel and energy to it that does make it feel as though this is a new place. A bold new place full of strange new worlds, friends to be made, foes to be defeated. It is a rich new realm of adventure and fun, which is so open and rich in possibility that I am sad that we didn't quite get as close to exploring its full potential as I really would have liked to have seen it done. Had the series had gone on for longer, maybe we'd have got a chance to do that, but I hope that we end up seeing more of it in the future, in a future series or story or what have you. I mean, we have a whole new generation of Z fighters that could easily have a side story here. We could have an adventure with Trunks and Goten, or maybe if we're going more to the Super 2 era timeline, we could have Pan and Oob, or hell, you could even have an adventure with Gohan and Videl, or any old or new characters, or characters that were introduced within this particular series having their own series of adventures here. And whilst I wish that we saw more of it, I still feel as though this world is presented as an open book, that there's still stuff that could be done here, whether that is a sequel series or a spin-off or some one-shot little adventure comic at some point in the future. I will say, and I don't want to spend too long ragging on Super, but with Super, despite the fact that it was an adventure set across the universe, across time, across the multiverse, in different timelines, it ultimately felt rather small, and far smaller than what we got in Daima, smaller than what we got in Z, and even smaller than we got in the original Dragon Ball for that matter. And that is due in no small part because I think that the world building in Super was kind of weak, whereas here that isn't the case. Now in fairness to Super, world building wasn't really its focus. When it did get into that kind of stuff, it was more to contextualise action more so than it was necessary to build out and create a more mystical and wider world. I will admit that I don't like that angle, but still that is certainly the direction it feels as though they went through with all of that. But here that isn't the case, as this series is certainly going out of its way to create a new world, give it its own personality, its own flair, with each one of those demon realms, those levels having their own personality, their own flair, their own colour palette, their own feel and their own vibe, which makes them far more interesting than the vast majority of stuff that regrettably we saw in GT and within Super itself. Once more, I really do wish we'd seen more of each realm, so at least more of the second realm, and that we had got more of the kind of adventures that we saw in the intro and outro sequence to this series, but I also feel that this series needed to lean more into visual storytelling here and there, particularly when we got to that second demon realm, but hey, at the very least, over the course of this adventure, we got an idea as to what the socio-economic status of these three realms is, even if we didn't get much of a look into their history or culture, but, you know, we can only review what's in front of us. I do feel as though this series does its lore and world building well. In terms of substance, from a fan perspective, it is mind-blowing. It really goes out of its way to recontextualise certain events and set up for ones that are in the future in a way which feels great, in a way that, despite what other people online may feel, I do not feel is decanonising Super. And it is all done in a way which means Dragon Ball as a series, it makes it feel larger, it makes it feel bigger, and it helps it to regain some sense of the mystical and pseudo-spiritual elements that it lost as Dragon Ball started to fade and pivot into being more science fiction orientated. It started to be more about superhero stuff and more about multiverses and stuff thereafter, and less about the martial art, mysticism, adventure stuff that we had previously. And all the while, it's able to do this whilst retaining Akira Toriyama's wit and spirit throughout all of this. All done in a way which felt effortless. It's not done in a way which feels as though it has a point to prove. It's not done in a way which is trying to sell a message or say that my mythology is better than yours or mine is deeper or edgier than yours. It's all done in a way which feels as though it has a spirit behind it, which, even if at the end of the day this ultimately only exists to be a fan service 40th anniversary thing, and that maybe certain elements are only here because some corpo prodded Akira Toriyama in the shoulder and said, alright, put Super Saiyan 4 in it because it's good for marketing, it's good for merchandise. At the end of the day, it's still presented in a way which feels fresh. It has an energy and a feel to it which is truly remarkable, with many of the lore moments that we get within this series being delivered in a way which feels human. They are raised in conversation. I thought your people exist. Why can't we do this thing? What is that thing? And it's all presented and asked in ways which feels that though that they are what you would expect from a good Doctor Who companion. That they are asking the questions that the audience wants to know, and they're always presented in ways which feel digestible and light and reasonable. Not always, it has to be said, as there certainly is that moment towards the mid part of the episode, or mid part of the series, I should say, where we get the sudden lord up from never as to how the universe came into existence. But notwithstanding, the vast majority of the lore stuff that we get is delivered in a way which has a feel and an energy behind it, which feels, like I say, effortless in a positive way. It feels as though this is just the way things are, the way things always been, and delivered in a way which feels as though it has a sense of weight and mysticism behind it that I really do love. Now, talking about the fight choreography in any great length, talking about the action sequences in any great length, is really difficult to do. Not because it's indescribable or it's beyond my capacity with which to do so, it's that for me personally, it's hard to talk about these things without feeling dweeby, like some kind of dweeby obsessive fanboy, or getting into a point where I'm just repeating myself over and over again, or just retelling certain fight sequences. But with that said, I admit that this section might be rather short. Look, in my opinion, and again, I hate when people talk about subjective opinions or objective fact, but in my opinion at least, this is the best action that we have seen in this series. Full stop. The entire thing, from original Dragon Ball up till now, this series contains some of the best action and best fight sequences we have ever had. And at the very least, if you ain't accepting that, for me at least, these are some of the best action sequences that we've had since I first started watching Z in the early 2000s. Not to lean too far on some arrays in the mid-series review, but about a couple of years ago, I rewatched Dragon Ball all the way through, from Dragon Ball into Z, into GT, and into Super. I found a thing on Twitch, don't worry about it, and as this marathon went on, I saw the quality of the fight sequences start to, for want of a better phrase, retrograde and decay with time. Oh sure, there was still a great degree of spectacle there were still some breathtaking moments, but the fight choreography just kind of disappeared. The physicality that we got in those fights within Dragon Ball just disappeared. The sense of martial arts that we had once seen just fiddled away. They disappeared into nothingness. And as time went by, it became more of a case of just raw power, flinging laser beams and fireballs and ki blasts at one another, and less about actually trying to outwit and outmaneuver our foes. Now, in fairness, Dragon Ball isn't really like that, as if we were to just go through every major fight, our heroes have more often than not punched well above their weight and had to use some rather tricksy abilities to get around the fact they are drastically underpowered versus the people that they are fighting. But Still, when you think about Dragon Ball and you think about action sequences, you know what you're seeing in your head, and while some of that stuff, again, in fairness, can be visceral and spectacular, sometimes it doesn't always feel quite as substantial as many of the series I certainly have seen since I started watching Dragon Ball. And with this series, or rather I should say, with Dragon Ball as things went by, it just kind of got worse with time. Oh sure, there are some brilliant fights within Super, some brilliant moments, particularly towards the end of it, but they lacked something for me. Oh sure, in Super you have fighters that are so strong that as they are fighting they can blast apart reality and holes in the universe and the fabric of existence itself, but for me, power alone doesn't make a fight interesting. It is the choreography, the presentation, the pacing of it which makes it interesting. This is why, for me, that bar fight that we got in episode 3 had greater skill and power and wit and peril and entertainment value than regrettably the vast majority of stuff that I saw in Super, because it genuinely felt like people were getting thumped and knocked about, which is something I don't think has really felt like has been the case with Dragon Ball for a worryingly long time. Yes, the fights in Daima are often of a lower scale, and whilst the fights themselves oftentimes lack the power and the super forms and the ki blast and the special techniques, they still feel that they are fights, that people really are getting knocked about, that there's a weighted impact to those moments. And most importantly, we get to see those moments. We get to see it all. This becomes especially true towards the end of the series, when we start to get back into those fights on the scale that you'd expect to see in Z and Super. When we have our big final fight with Goku versus Goma, Goku and his friends versus Goma, we see everything. We see the full gambit of all the tropes, new powers, people flicking about the place doing the ju stuff, the shooting laser blasts left and right. This is all stuff we see in other forms of Dragon Ball, but here we see all of it. When people are flicking about and do the ju thing, we see everything that they are doing. It isn't just like it feels as though it's just done because we need to convey power, but we don't have the time and the energy with which to animate a full action sequence. By the end of all of this, when we get the big fight with Goku and his friends fighting Goma, and then particularly with Goku fighting Goma, it all feels like this is what the fight with Goku and his friends versus Jiren should have looked like. Oh sure, the final act of that fight in Super is spectacular, but more often than not, that whole series of fights and that whole arc itself felt as though it lacked so much, certainly in comparison to what we get here, because this is a fight, Goku and his friends versus Goma, or Goku versus Goma himself. It all had a sense of scale to it, a sense of power, speed, strength, skill, cinematography, great pacing, a great tone to it. This is the big epic battle to end it all, and it is all done with that sense of power, scale and energy and animation to it, which blows almost everything that happens in Super well out the water. It does it in such a way that, look, let's be blunt, whatever you may think of Daima, whether you love it or you hate it, this is what the fights in Dragon Ball need to look like from here on out. Whether that is in Super 2 or whether they end up calling or some future Dragon Ball series, they need to have this level of just craft put into it, because this felt like it was a true final battle. Even if it was done over the course of several episodes with all the twists and turns that you expected, at the end of the day it had a level of scale to it, it had a level of craft and a level of just awe to it, which is truly deserving of the title of Big Final Battle. Now, I understand that not every fight can be like this from a pure logistical point of view, from an animation point of view. As I mentioned in the past, you wouldn't do this kind of level of animation for Goku versus just a bunch of random mooks, but hell, you've got the template from the bar pipe from episode 3 to get into that. So we have this template here. It's stuff that we can build from. Again, you may love Daima, you may hate Daima to your very core, but at the end of the day, I think we can all agree that we can't go back to Dragon Ball looking like Super. Certainly not the early part of it, and to a certain degree, not the end part of it. This is a template of what the series needs to follow in the future. I mean, just imagine if the fight with Jiren looked as good as the fight with Goku in his Super Saiyan 4 form versus Goma in the final couple episodes or so. That would have been spectacular. But regrettably, as good as that fight was, as enjoyable as the fight with Jiren was, It ultimately wasn't that good for me. And the last point of praise I will give this series is that this series felt like a genuine love letter to Dragon Ball as a series. Almost all of it, just a great big celebration of almost every aspect of it, where possible and where logical. From Dragon Ball to Z to GT, Super, even some of the video games. This feels like one great message to the fans, one great celebration of the entire thing, and a celebration of this great shared experience that many of us have had. From those that started watching Dragon Ball way back in the day, who now, much like Goku themselves, now find themselves as grandparents, who are now sharing of these adventures with their kids and their grandkids. For those who started watching it with Z and grew up with Gohan and saw some of their own struggles reflected within him. For those who watch GT and now have some bittersweet memories of people that aren't here anymore, and for those who came in through Super and have this whole new world of adventures before them, this series, yes, it is terribly fan servicey, but it's done in a way which, for me at least, doesn't feel cynical or too corporate. It's not done in a way which feels as though it's being ironic or seeks to dismiss, delegitimize, or decanonize certain events. Oh sure, there's certain aspects of it that have a few question marks around them now that we've seen the entire thing, but even still, as a whole entity, as a whole story, it's a celebration of everything that we love of Dragon Ball. It recaptures the adventurous feelings of original Dragon Ball, the action of Z, the flair of Super, the wild imagination of GT, and the almost anything goes feeling of Xenoverse and the Heroes games and series. Now, according to at least one large Dragon Ball broadcaster on this site, they say that not a lot of people like original Dragon Ball, or at least they don't like the adventure-focused half of it. They hate it. They think it's terrible. They're saying other people say that, and they feel that. I don't know whether they feel about that, but I'm sure that this opinion that they have, or this information that they have on this opinion, is well researched, and by their reckoning, that everything that happened before the end of the Red Ribbon saga is, people don't like it. The majority of the fan base don't like it, apparently. And maybe that's true. Maybe this is an opinion that is well researched and something they've come to over the course of many months of research into it. But for me, I love adventure stories, and I love that part of the series. It's one of my most favourite series of events that is in Dragon Ball. Full stop is that early half that we get in Dragon Ball. I love original Dragon Ball. I love the adventure side of it. I love the action side of it. I love the half of Z that has the adventure in it. I love the part of GT which still had that, and the few episodes of Super that had all that. I love adventure stories where our cast go to new places, meet new people, new cultures and new civilizations, meet villains that are strange and esoteric, and they have to find a way in getting to defeat them. And for me, this series gave me that sense of wonder back that I had when I first started watching Dragon Ball, and I was watching Gohan trying to explore the world around him, trying to escape from Piccolo. And then later, it gave me that sense of awe that I had when I got into Z and I saw our heroes trying to take down Frieza, the androids, Cell, Boo, the Saiyans, Garlic Jr., because I'm one of those people that do love the Garlic Jr. saga. And this series made me feel that sense of just joy that I had when I used to watch Dragon Ball back in the day. Even at the end of it all, even that in that final episode, there was this sense of relief that this had all worked out in the way that I hoped it would do, and that this series was able to do all these things, tip its cap to all these things from its past, but in a way that still felt fresh and new, and not just an echo of what came before it, and wasn't just a remember Star Wars thing. Remember Super Saiyan 4? Well, it's back! Which you kind of argue to a certain degree that it does do, but for me it still does it in a way which feels fresh. That this isn't just an echo, this isn't just a Remember Star Wars thing, that this isn't just a fan's interpretation of what Dragon Ball should be. This feels like Dragon Ball. This feels like this is giving us something new. New friends, new foes, new places, new things to see and do. All done with a sense of warmth, cheer and joy that is what we've all loved from this daft old series that's kept us going for all this time. Oh sure, it would be easy to just sit here and say that Daima is just GT but done right, but I feel that there's more to it than that. That yes, this does to a certain degree feel like a greatest hits of Dragon Ball, but it doesn't do it quite in a way which is overt. Again, it isn't going fully into the well of remember this thing, well it's back again. This feels like a true celebration of Dragon Ball. Not a video game, not a manga return, not some other we're bringing in Moro now kind of way. This feels like a celebration of everything, a tribute to the entire cloth of this series, sometimes in ways that feel overt, sometimes covert, but all them done in a way which feels honest. I will admit this is kind of hard for me to discuss because it gets into vibe talk, and as I mentioned in the past, you know, maybe at the end of the day, reason why some of these elements are in this series was just because some corpo was prodding Akira Toriyama in the shoulder saying, right, put Super Saiyan 4 in it because we need to sell more product. Put this thing into it because we need to sell more product. And even if that is the case, this is still done in a way which felt as though it has respect and joy and sincerity for the series as a whole, which is something I cannot praise enough, particularly bearing in mind the landscape of all the legacy television series that we see right now and other legacy series that we see right now. This wasn't a new series of Dragon Ball. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't a successor. It wasn't a mirror. This was Dragon Ball. This is a series that we always knew and we always loved, but just in a different state, which some may love, some may hate, but that's for you to decide. And with that said, however, let's get into the negatives. Now, in Wholehearted Honesty, when it comes to the negatives, my negatives that I have of this series as a whole are pretty much exactly the same negatives that I had for my mid-series review. Though slightly tweaks given, you know, changing events. So with that said, I'm not going to spend too long talking about at least two of them because they're self-explanatory, and if you want my full feelings on them, go back and see the mid-series review. With that said, however, the headline negatives is I think the editing in some episodes is baffling. I think it pivots too far, too soon from the adventurous tone, and I think the pacing as a whole entity is inconsistent. The bad editing stuff is self-evident. There was at least a 2 or 3 episode run where you'd have these weird moments where the screen would just fade to black. But it was done in a way which felt odd, like they were trying to save time, like they needed an extra 2 or 3 seconds, so they just take something out of like a ship moving forward, or a camera pan, or just something like that, because maybe the episode itself ran on for a little bit too long otherwise. Of course, you could argue that maybe starting almost every episode with a near 2-minute discussion as to what a Saiyan is and what Dragon Balls are, to then have a 2-minute intro sequence itself took far too much runtime for the episode, which is certainly where I'd argue things, but still the editing feels odd. It feels almost like you're watching the TV edit of a movie that maybe the broadcasters felt was a bit too violent or went on a little bit too long. To be fair, it isn't quite as bad as the edit points that we have in the UK TV release of Super, but even still, it just feels rather odd that they would just try to cut 2 or 3 seconds here and there in just this way. The second issue, as far as this is concerned, is I think it pivots from the adventurous tone too soon. Look, I know that not a lot of people like the adventurous side of Dragon Ball. I understand that. I know not everyone is a fan of original Dragon Ball. As I've said in the past, I love it. And when this series started to get back into that feeling and flavour, I loved it, but I think that it gives up on that far too soon. And that we stopped getting our adventures with Goku and his friends very, very quickly, with a lot of that being replaced with just Arinsu and her evil machinations, which, whilst interesting, do feel as though they took away a lot of adventures that our heroes could have had together. And this also meant that as time went by, the chances that we had to develop the characters of Pansy and Glorio became increasingly less able to do so, particularly when Vegeta and the others came into it, which meant that Pansy and Glorio, by the end of it, felt rather irrelevant to the series of events that we had here. That they ultimately ended up just being cheerleaders for Goku and his friends, rather than just active participants in the invention itself. Which is a shame, particularly when you bear in mind that with Glorio, he had a major role to play in this series, with a backstory that is dark that we've had hinted to that he just didn't get into. And with Pansy, she is the daughter of the king of entire realm, a freedom fighter, a technician who was trying to save people from enslavement, and ultimately doesn't mean much of a muchness as soon as Bulma comes along and ultimately fills the same role in the story as her, being the technician that fixes everything. And of course, Degasu being an absolute flat zero as a villain, just it feels as though there's a lot of moments going to be spent to build out these characters and give them a bit more of a time to shine and make their importance and their placement in this series feel a lot better, but in the end, we didn't get that, and I'm not going to lean too much onto this, but it's a disappointment. Now, much has been said about the pacing of this series. If I'm going to be blunt, I do think that whilst there are some people that have certainly been criticising the pacing from an honest and educated point of view, they know what they're talking about, and it's clear that they know what they're talking about. It does feel as though other people have been criticising the pacing without really knowing what pacing is, and they're using that phrase because they've heard other reviewers and critics using it. They feel that it sounds professional, and so they're using it to sound professional themselves. Maybe because they want their dissatisfaction with the series to sound professional and not personal. And why they'd want to do that, I don't know, because these reviews are your own personal opinion. Like, looking professional shouldn't matter. You're doing this for YouTube. You're not doing this for academia, for fuck's sake. You can be as brutally honest as you want to about your feelings with this. If you hated it, oh my god, I've seen reviews on this site where they've absolutely laid into it without any sense of mercy. It very much is a God, stop them, they're already dead kind of thing. I know that's not the exact quote, but you get the idea. But with that said, the biggest criticism that I've seen repeated time and again, particularly in the early part of it, was that this series takes too long for anything to happen. Now, I will admit I disagree with that fundamentally, because I think that if you are looking for a more action-orientated series, much in the pattern of Super, it doesn't get into that stuff early enough, but this is a series that is trying to tell a story, not trying to just adapt a movie where that stuff already happened fairly early on in that movie. I feel that pound for pound, each episode itself is paced well and frequently does everything it needs to do without feeling rushed or dragged out. And every episode, possibly with the exception of the Giants, I think still does this very well. Each episode is paced well for what it needs to do. It introduces aspects of the world and the lore well. It builds out the world and the lore well at a reasonable pace, and either takes us on an adventure that feels fun or an action sequence that feels thrilling. My problem isn't with the episodes themselves, or the fact that the big ticket action moments didn't come sooner, as I feel that overall the episodes themselves again are evenly paced out, and that the story as a whole puts those moments roughly where they need to be, even if it feels at times they're not done in a way which feels as though it has necessarily the level of guile or creativity that I really would expect from a seasoned writer from Akira Toriyama. My problem isn't the fact that, it took too long for anything to happen in the first act. My problem is that now looking at this series as a whole entity, as one long story, the pacing as one long story feels off. Again, individual episodes, okay. The opening act does everything an opening act should do in terms of pacing. It gives everything enough time to breathe. It gives us and an audience enough time to understand this world as it is and how it functions. It's everything thereafter that things start to fall apart for me. The second act feels incredibly tight and condensed, and the final act does just what it needs to with the little time that it has. In the opening third, like I say, this is a time that we get more than enough time to see the world, understand how it works, how it functions, we understand its history, its backstory, we get some fun and adventure. As far as the story is concerned, it does this stuff perfectly well. It does everything that the opening act of a story should do. The second act is where things start to fall apart, as far too much time is just spent with our characters stood around waiting for people to show up, and then all we really get is one extending action sequence with Vegeta finding a squid and finding a robot guy, and just one massive out-of-place lore dump. A time that could have been spent to explore this world, understand it, just is ruined for the sake of, you guys better take the long way around. Ha 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 ha. Why? God only knows. Maybe originally there was supposed to be more here. I don't really know. And the end, I do enjoy it, but as I say, it's rather by the numbers. There was a point fairly late on in this series, when you look back in my previous reviews, where I was able to guess out exactly what was going to happen with this series, even if I didn't know the specific events. I knew that in this episode, this thing would happen, in this episode, that thing would happen, and it pretty much happened exactly as predicted. The middle portion is the big stumbling moment in this series. You can argue that the opening act went on a little bit too long. There's an argument to be there. There's a debate to be had there. But the middle portion just spent far too much time just standing around and not really doing anything and going on these rather odd adventures that felt like padding when they really didn't need to be. I mean, sure, this isn't going to follow a traditional 3-act structure. Sure, why not? But even still, it does feel as though there's not much that really happens in that second act. It feels that ultimately this is a 2-act story. There are 2 halves of it rather than a 3-part. Even if it is specifically built to be a 3-part story because this story takes place over 3 worlds. The middle portion of this story is the massive flaw with this episode, this entire thing. Because it doesn't really give us much to work with. We have a massive lord and we have a fun action sequence, but ultimately it doesn't do any of this with the level of skill and craft that we saw in that opening act. And it is a massive disappointment thereafter, as it ends up taking a lot of time for what comes later. If we were to have a very short middle portion, a short middle act, sure, fine, make it short, but don't waste time, because then, at the very least, you give more time for that final act, so we can have those extra complications, those extra twists, those extra moments of uncertainty, where it feels as though, oh, there's darker things happening than we really expected them to be. Maybe the opening act went on far too long, maybe the series as a whole entity's far too short, but even with the time that you have, it's mind-blowing to me that pretty much as soon as Vegeta and the others enter into the demon realm, that everything just starts to collapse and fall apart, because it feels as though from that point on, the pacing just gets incredibly wonky, that we now start lollygagging, we start padding out for time when it doesn't really need to be done so. And that's a disappointment to me. My feeling is that it isn't a case of nothing happened or it took too long to do anything, because I will be blunt, the opening act of this series does everything an opening act should do. And that if the people screaming about pacing really knew what they were talking about, they wouldn't say that. They wouldn't be criticising the pacing of the opening act, because it does everything that that part of the story needs to do. You can dislike the quality and content therein, but you can't criticise the pacing of it, because it does everything that it needs to do with the time that it has. Of course, had this been a 30 or 40 episode series, it would be less of a problem, because then the second act and the third act would have had enough time to breathe, and even if you made the first act shorter, it still wouldn't change the fact that the middle act doesn't have much of anything within it whatsoever. It is a lot of standing around and not really doing much, and all it would have really done is just had more adventures, but in this case now Vegeta's there to look grumpy and Piccolo for to do nothing. Because he didn't really do much of a muchness through this entire thing now, did he? It really is kind of baffling to me that, again, the first act of it I think is brilliantly well put together, and it has fantastic pacing for what it is. But pretty much as soon as Vegeta and the others join in, that's when everything just starts to break and to crumble. Maybe they weren't supposed to be in this series at all, and that's partly why it fell apart in the way that it did do. Or they're supposed to come in late. I really don't know, but it's in the second act that everything starts to fumble, that we just waste a lot of time that isn't really need to be wasted. If you just want the big action sequences, then do the big action sequences and use the episodes you have left over to build out that final act. Because when we get into that final act, everything is by the numbers. It's great for what it is, but everything is by the numbers. Some plot points faded from sight in a way which is understandable. The Gendarmerie Force being not much of a muchness, fine. Arinsu's plans and schemes being subverted and undermined, sure, that is fine. But certain aspects like the fusion bugs, Degasu's hard heel turn towards the end, and Glorio's betrayal didn't really go anywhere. Oh sure, the fusion bugs could easily just be a Toriyama gag, but Degasu deciding to kidnap a baby and Glorio betraying Arinsu didn't go anywhere. There wasn't anything there for him. And that maybe if you got rid of the episode with the giants and just had an episode, had Vegeta come into this play of things an episode sooner, you'd have 2 extra episodes that could have explored those things. An episode where it felt as though Glorio really had gone over to the dark side, or that Degasu really could turn into this big villain, and we could have more of a backstory to why they are the way they are, why they made the choice they would do, or they did do, rather than just, it's in my nature, as what they fucking well had. Because some of those things, like I say, the minor complications, the Gendarmerie Force and losing the fusion bugs, I can accept them for being what they are. But some of them are major plot points that should have had more time to work on them. And maybe they would have had that second act of the story not been such an absolute mess. Again, I still think is even if you did the opening act shorter, cut it by a couple episodes, had less wacky adventure stuff, you still have the problem that second act still wouldn't bloody well work because it's still a lot of sitting around and waiting for things. It just would have meant that we'd have more little adventures with Vegeta and the others. With Vegeta and Piccolo, as I said in the past, it feels as though as for the context of this story, their personalities are too similar. They're ultimately stoic, kind of quiet character. Well, Vegeta isn't, he's more of a blowhard and loudmouth, but you get the idea. I still feel that this series as a whole, and not to get into the overview prematurely, I still think it holds together well, and I think the destination is worth the journey. I will admit I've not done a full rewatch to see this as one extended story, and I'm not sure how it would do in that regard because of just how wonky that middle portion is. It really does throw a spanner into everything. Yes, we can, again, argue whether or not that opening act should have been as long as it is to. There's at least, episode 2 is such a zero that you probably could have cut that and just had Goku immediately going into the Demon Realm, which would have saved us an episode. You could have had Vegeta meeting up the others, which would have saved us an episode. You could have dropped the episode with them going to see the giant hamster planet. That's 3 episodes extra that you could have added in at any point to maybe give Goku an extra adventure in the first act, make the action sequence in the middle feel a lot bigger with Vegeta and the other, or give us an episode of really getting to the lore of the Glind and the Namekians, or maybe in the final act having that moment where it really does look like Glorio's gone to the dark side and that Degasu is the true villain behind all of this, but in the end we don't get that. As again, I don't think that it's individual sections are necessary. Well, yes I do, because I've just talked about it for the past 10 minutes or so, but as a whole entity, I think that, without getting into the overview, I think the pacing of this thing works. I think the first act of this thing is paced perfectly. It's everything thereafter that kind of falls apart, and I'm not sure if that's because the first act went on for too long, or it's just that it was just poorly structured thereafter. With that said, however, let us get into the overview and just say that, look, this is everything that I have wanted from Dragon Ball since Z ended in the UK nearly 20 years ago. I know that it isn't for everyone, and that some people out there have more than just expressed the fact that they dislike it. And look, if they are admitting that and they are saying that in ways that are honest, then all the power to them. I know that there are some people out there who have hated every moment of this, and fair play to them. With some of them, I do feel as though maybe they don't hate it to the extent that they're really pretending to. They just see their audience and how they've reacted to it, and they decided to lean into that, and they're not being sincere with all of this, and that maybe a year or so down the line you'll suddenly get a video going, "Was I wrong about Daima?" And we'll just see how things go from there, because I certainly do remember, at least tangentially, seeing a lot of people questioning whether Super was any good when that started. Then now all of a sudden a lot of those broadcasts are talking about it like it was the second coming of Christ, but that's a whole of discussion. This whole affair with, and I'm not going to go into a huge rant about the wider broadcasting landscape when it comes to talking about Dragon Ball Daima, but it does feel as though there's a lot of people that were just watching it just to hate watch it. And that's fine if you're someone that isn't making a YouTube series, but there's a lot of people, it does feel like they hate watching it purely for the sake of content, because they are content creators and not broadcasters, and that there were some people that were trying to turn their displeasure about this series into some almost grand culture war fiasco, and bending over themselves backwards to try and create some kind of grand controversy to sell to the audience, and then ultimately not going quite the way that they had planned it to. Because at the end of the day, I do love this, and if people hate this, that's their own doing. I just wish that when people hate this stuff, they're being sincere about it, and I'm not 100% sure that everyone that hated this is being sincere about it. And I do feel that certain other people, whilst they may be sincere about their hatred to it, they're hating it not because they think the series itself is just crap of its own merits. They're hating it because it isn't Super 2, and they still want Moro, even though, let's be honest, that's probably going to happen in the next couple of years or so. And it is kind of baffling to me just how many broadcasts there has been online that have kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, they've kind of looked the other way as far as the initial fan reaction has been. Because from my point of view, it doesn't really matter whether or not Toei had released a trailer for Dragon Ball Daima at the same time they released the trailer at the comic convention thing or whatever it was. Because it doesn't really matter whether or not the first depiction of everyone that everyone had to it was the guy saying, "Don't be Dragon Ball Magic, don't be Dragon Ball Magic." Because at the end of the day, they reflect a part of the audience that really did look at this and say, "Oh, please, for God's sake, don't be Dragon Ball Magic." because that's just a reaction that a lot of people had with it, and it wouldn't have mattered whether you got the trailer at the same time or before that or whatever. You still would have had people going, "Don't be Dragon Ball Magic. What the hell is this? We want Morrow, not this GT level shit." And they were never going to accept anything other than Super Part 2. And that's just the way that it is. It doesn't matter whether or not this released simultaneously with the dub and the sub at the same time, because some people, with all due respect to them, they never wanted this. They wanted Super Part 2. They didn't want Dragon Ball Magic, and that's just at the end of the day how things washed out with them. But still, to pivot it back to the actual substance of this, I love this. Whether this is Dragon Ball Magic or Dragon Ball GT Redux Edition, I loved every moment of it. Oh sure, there's some episodes I love more than others, there's some aspects of it I love more than others, and I think that as a whole entity, by God, the pacing of it, by the time you get to the big section, it does feel as though it just loses weight quite a bit, but even still, the juice is very much worth the squeeze, and at the end of the day, I have loved pretty much every moment of this series. With that said and done, however, let's get into Comment Corner! It's time for Comment Corner for the final time in relation to Dragon Ball Daima, unless I suddenly get a big influx of comments on this video, and thus that warrants a follow-up video going through all the comments, or if there's, you know, not some kind of big reveal that, oh, there's a Season 2 coming up, or a movie, but we'll soon see about that. With that said, for the final time, for the time being at least, we have Big X1 who says, I think that in the end, I like Daima more than I thought I would. It gets off to a slow start, but it gets better. I think I need to rewatch it though. Thank you for your comment, and I have to agree and disagree at the same time. I did enjoy the early part of the series where it did have that slower pace, and as I've said previously, I think the pacing of that wasn't as big of a problem as a lot of people make it out to be. I think that it's a lot of cases of just people were expecting a lot more. They were brought up with a different form of Dragon Ball, so understandably there was something I think of a degree of culture shock there, but still, I get it, I understand it, and I am sympathetic towards it, and I do feel as though this entire series does need a proper rewatch at some point. Just watching it like just one long extended thing, just one big binge watch, I think would definitely solidify some of my thoughts and feelings on that. But hey, I can always do a retrospective in a year or two's time and just see how things go, see how it holds up to time. Though granted, depending on how things wash out, hey, we might have a whole new anime at some point over the next couple of years anyway, so maybe we won't have the time. But in any case, thank you all for listening, thank you all for watching, thank you for your support over this period. This is the first time I've covered a different anime series aside from My Hero Academia. I have dipped my toes in with others here and there. That hasn't really manifested itself that much, but hey, if there's other anime series or such that you think I should take a look at, I will try to. I can't guarantee anything at the moment because my work schedule is very, well, busy at the moment, so I can't really dedicate myself to anything or guarantee anything, but still, we'll see where we go. But between then and now, I'll say thank you all for listening, thank you all for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye! Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!